Evet, İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi'nin 37. buluşmasına hoş geldiniz. Yeni bir yılda, yeni bir yüzle karşınızdayız. Bugünkü konuğumuz Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Dilbilim Bölümü öğretim üyesi Doktor Ömer Demirok. Öncelikle kendisine davetimizi kırmayıp bizi konuşma teklifimizi kırmayıp geldiği için teşekkür ediyoruz. Hem Dilbilim Bölümü hem de İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi olarak. Ben konuşmacımızla ilgili kısa bir özgeçmiş bilgisi vermek istiyorum tanımayanlar için. Ömer Demirok 2010 yılında Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Yabancı Dil Eğitim Bölümünden mezun oldu. 2013 yılında da yine Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Dilbilim Bölümünden yüksek lisansını aldı. Yüksek lisans derecesini aldı. 2019 yılında da daha sonrasında tabii doktora çalışmalarını Amerika'da yürütmek üzere Boston'a taşındı ve MIT'den 2019 yılında doktora derecesiyle mezun olup tekrar ülkeye dönüp 2020 yılında Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Dilbilim Bölümünde doktora öğretim üyesi olarak çalışmaya başladı. Ben sözü Ömer Hoca'ya bırakmak istiyorum müsaadenizle. Buyurun hocam.
Teşekkürler Murat Hocam. Hem tanıtmanız için hem de davetiniz için. Katılımcılara da teşekkür ediyorum geldikleri için. Başlayabilirim sanıyorum. Ekranım görünüyor mu? Tamam. Alright, bir not. Dilbilim terimlerine çok aşina olmadığım için Türkçe'de. O yüzden sunumu İngilizce yapacağım ama soru cevap kısmında Türkçe konuşabiliriz. Yani hiçbir sorun yok. Alright. So let me start by saying that this is a joint work with Ümit Atlamaz and Metin Bağrıaçık. They are not here, I don't think. All right, so this is a very loaded title, right? So a dependent case theoretic account of alignment shifts in heritage grammars. It presupposes quite a bit, as you can see. Right, so we have, you may be familiar with all of these, or maybe you know some of these. I don't know. So I won't presuppose anything, and I'll try to give you some background on each of these. So what is case alignment? I'll talk about this a bit, and then I'll say a few words about what dependent case theories say about case alignment. And then finally, I'll talk about what we call heritage grammars, or what I mean by heritage grammars. All right, so and after this background, we'll get to describing the case alignment patterns in two heritage grammars and how they differ from the respective standard varieties, right? So we'll look at two dialects, two linguistic systems, which are heritage varieties, Kurmanji and Georgian, and then we'll try to understand how we actually ended up with these, with the alignment patterns that we observe in these varieties from the lens of the dependent case theory, right? So we'll look at the changes from that perspective. All right, so what is case alignment? So most of you are probably familiar with this, so I'll just be brief. So as you know, many languages overtly mark their MPs with some morphology that we like to call case, right? So we don't really have a good answer good answer to the question of what case really is. What sort of information does it encode? Is it some relation between some head and the MP, between the MP and some head, or is it a relation between MPs, or is it encoding some information about the MP itself? So there have been different sorts of answers, but before we even get to that, there is this very familiar observation that there is cross-linguistic variation in the way MPs are marked together, right? So different languages may choose to case mark different MPs in the same way, or leave them unmarked for that matter. So I'll show you what I mean by this. For example, when you look at Turkish, if you suspend your more advanced knowledge about the differential marking of objects, whatever. So let's just idealize Turkish with proper names. And if you look at this piece of data, you notice that the object has a marker, right? So that we call accusative case, whereas the subjects are unmarked, and that we call that nominative. So we see that, here the accusative appears on the object of a transitive verb, right? So this is one kind of system where the object of a transitive verb is singled out for case marking, and the subjects patterned together. They bear nominative marking. Not all languages are like Turkish. Obviously, we also have languages like Shpibo. This data is from Baker and Bobelik. So here, what we find is we find a special marker on the subject of a transitive verb, right? So subject, instead of an object, we find a special marker on the subject of a transitive verb, whereas the subject of an intransitive verb, like Maria died, appears nominative, it's unmarked, and the object of a transitive verb is also unmarked, right? So what the special marker goes on to the subject of a transitive verb. And the typical label that people use for this is ergative, right? So you're all familiar with the fact that we call this accusative, and people don't call this accusative generally. Not generally, never. Rather, they call this ergative, right? So that's the sort of label we have for that. All right. Languages like Turkish, which single out the object of a transitive verb for case marking, they are called accusative. They are said to have accusative alignment, right? So case alignment. What you find here is that you find the accusative marking on the object of a transitive verb, and everything else remains unmarked or gets some marker which is the same, right? So we call that nominative. And Shpibo, on the other hand, languages like Shpibo, they single out the subject of a transitive verb instead of the object. And in such a system, what we observe is that, transitive clauses with a subject and an object, you find ergative on the subject, whereas in intransitive clauses, you don't find any ergative whatsoever, right? So you simply find an unmarked case. So this is called the ergative alignment. So these are the two types of main alignment systems for case marking. All right, so the crucial thing here, obviously, if you have noticed the fact that I'm referring to transitive verb in both cases, we are talking about transitivity. So what is transitivity? It's, by the simple logic, you can say that in transitive clauses, there are two MPs, where in transitive clauses, you have only one MP. And the crucial observation here is that, you get to see accusative and ergative only if there's another MP nearby, right? So if there is another MP in the clause, then you can see accusative or ergative depending on the language. But otherwise, if there's only one MP, you don't see any of these cases, right? So neither of these cases. You only see nominative, like the unmarked case. So this sort of, this state of affairs could suggest that case actually may be encoding a relation between MPs, right? Why do we say that? Because relation inherently needs at least two things. For there to be a relation, there needs to be two things. So then maybe you can say accusative and ergative, they are cases which are encoding such a relation, the presence of such a relation. So for example, just repeating what we have just said, essentially, so you expect under this sort of, thinking, you expect the accusative to be impossible when there's only one MP in the clause, right? So for example, we won't have accusative on the subjects of intransitive verbs ever in Turkish. And similarly, even if you have, some accusative on the object of a transitive verb, when you passivize that, the accusative cannot remain, right? So you can't use it anymore, simply because passivization removes one of the MPs from the clause. So you end up with one MP, so the accusative cannot be used anymore, right? So it's the simple logic. So essentially, we only see accusative if there is another MP in the clause, and the same facts hold for the ergative case, right? So they both exhibit this sort of behavior. So passivization should remove, for example, ergative case, should make it impossible to say anything in ergative. So the dependent case theory essentially builds on this insight, right? So it goes back to Marantz's paper, and a bit like further back actually, but that he made it kind of like he brought it into attention of many other linguists in the generative tradition, and recently has been elaborated on from more recent thinking in syntax, right? So what is the wisdom in dependent case theory? They say that this behavior of the fact that accusative and ergative cases are they can only be they can only surface if there is another MP in the clause. They attribute this behavior to this, to the special status of the cases, right? So these are both dependent cases. They are encoding that there is another MP in the clause. In that sense, they are called dependent cases. And from this, in this way of thinking, nominative is actually simply the realization of caseless, or it could be taken as the realization of caselessness. So by caselessness, we don't mean that actual, like there can't be any morphology indicating nominative. So this is more of an abstract, abstract sense of caselessness. If you think of, case assignment or case determination, case calculus, whatever you want to call it, if you take it to happen in syntax in some abstract sense, these are values, right? So ergative, ergative, accusative, these are values for realizing some morphology. It's E in Turkish, Ka in some other language, whatever, right? So you will have different exponents realizing it. So it's distinct from the actual thing that we pronounce. Essentially, what we mean by when we say nominative is the realization of cases is what we mean is that if an MP has has gone through the entire derivation without receiving any case value in syntax, then the morphology component or the realization component, whatever you want to call it, it says, oh, you have not received any case, so I will give you a default pronunciation for you. Let me put something. It's Turkish won't do anything. It will just pronounce the MP. Its nominative is never marked. But some other language might have a special way to pronounce such MPs, right? So you might actually have some exponent there. All right. Okay. So essentially, what is the difference between accusative and ergative? Essentially, what we want to say is that ergative, whenever you have two MPs in the clause, if your language wants to specially mark the higher one, we call that case ergative. It's essentially the upward dependent case, right? So it's a dependent case. Both accusative and ergative are dependent cases, but their directionality is different, right? So which MP conditions the special case on the other? So is it the higher one or the lower one? The lower one is called the accusative and the higher one is called the ergative, right? And so if you have only one MP, on the other hand, there is going to be no conditioning of the dependent case. So the conditions for the assignment of dependent case won't be met, which means your MP will remain unmarked, in terms of abstract case value, and the realization of that MP will be however your language wants to pronounce nominatives, right? So if you had some training in more Chomskyan weave of syntax, this might seem a bit like, what the hell is going on here? So you have to forget that, right? So this is kind of like going against the sort of wisdom that case is checked by some head or something. So this is completely distinct from that way of thinking. All right, so this is dependent case theory. So now we can move on to what we mean by heritage grammars. So inside linguistics and outside linguistics, there are many different uses of the term heritage language. So I won't be introducing you to all of those notions. I don't know all of them either. So I will simply talk about two scenarios which are typically associated with heritage grammars. And by heritage grammars, I mean the generative way of thinking about grammar, like as a mental object, right? So you have that mental representation of the language in your head, and that's what I mean by the grammar here. And so the two scenarios that I'm gonna talk about is the attrition and the incomplete attainment scenario. So attrition is essentially a decline in linguistic proficiency, and incomplete attainment is essentially incomplete acquisition, right? So you have stopped learning before it was complete, so to speak. All right, so here's a probable attrition scenario. So Ahmet, this guy was, these are hypothetical obviously, but they're people like that. So Ahmet was born to a Turkish-speaking family in Yozgat. In 1970, when he was only 13, he went to Norway with his family, right? So bye-bye, lucky guy. He picked up Norwegian there and uses it proficiently in his everyday life now. So he's still in Norway, and he still uses some Turkish to speak to his parents at home, right? So this is what we have. So more than decades have passed, obviously, because he went there in 1970. And we would qualify Ahmet here probably as a heritage speaker of Turkish. even though Turkish is actually his first language, right? So the L1, so first native language. His daily use of Turkish has been quite limited for decades. He has been there for like 50 years or something, compared to his L2 Norwegian, where he uses everywhere, like at work and social circles, wherever. So at home, when he's talking to his family, he's using Turkish, but everywhere else, he has Norwegian surrounding him. So obviously, we might expect that his linguistic abilities in Turkish have kind of decayed a bit. That's the attrition scenario, and that's a one way of characterizing a heritage, or one type of heritage grammar, let's say. And here is a possible incomplete attainment scenario. So we have Dilan. Okay, Dilan was born to a Kurmanji-speaking family, Kurdish-speaking family, and her parents chose to talk to her only in Turkish, right? So they said, oh, she will have an accent and whatever. So they said, okay, let's talk only in Turkish. So they did that. So, but Dilan's grandmother, who occasionally visited the family, was a monolingual Kurmanji speaker. She didn't speak any Turkish. So when she was there, she obviously spoke Kurdish, Kurmanji. So as a child, Dilan picked up some Kurmanji from her grandmother. But Dilan only received education in Turkish and almost never uses Kurmanji in her daily life, right? So we have many speakers like this in Turkey as well. So here we clearly have a heritage speaker of Kurmanji. Dilan was exposed to the Kurmanji very early in her life, right? Grandmother probably came and visited for 3 months and spoke Kurmanji. So she picked up some Kurmanji for sure. But her exposure to Kurmanji was quite limited because it wasn't a continuous input, and the grandmother is not the main caregiver, so it's not going to be enough for the full-fledged Kurmanji grammar to emerge, right? So essentially, her Kurmanji developed under very constrained inputs, right? If it ever developed, probably it did. It would be developed under very constrained amount of input. All right, so these are our two scenarios. We'll be more interested in, we will not be interested in the attrition scenario, we'll be interested in the incomplete attainment scenario. All right, so what's next? Essentially what we are doing in this study is we are investigating two heritage grammars. One, the Kurmanji spoken by a Turkish Kurmanji bilingual speaker, and the other is a Georgian, heritage Georgian spoken by a Georgian Turkish bilingual speaker. And we investigate the case alignment. We don't focus on anything else. We only look at the case alignment patterns, right? So both Kurdish, all Kurdish dialects, I think, and Kurmanji in particular, and Georgian, they have ergativity in their systems. So it will be, that discussion was, important for this purpose. So our main claim will be that the heritage varieties that we're looking at, heritage, so I will be using these labels for ease of referring to them. So heritage Kurmanji, heritage Georgian, they are results, they are products of incomplete attainment. So what do we mean by incomplete attainment? We can visualize that as follows, right? So you have, the kid is born and people speak, and that input, when the child hears the input, they will extract rules, or whatever they do, they will extract rules and learn those rules, consequentially, and they will reach the adult grammar after a while, right? So however the adults speak, they will end up with that. So this is the acquisition path, let's say. And the heritage zone, what we label heritage zone here is, in case of incomplete attainment, you essentially end up with an incomplete grammar, so to speak, right? So you have learned something, but it's not yet, it's not an incomplete grammar in any sense, other than the fact that it's different from the grammar that the adults speak. So it's not inferior or anything. It's just different from the grammar of the adult. It's still a language. It's perfectly fine. It's a grammar, but it's different from the one that the adults speak, the adults around the kids speak. So that's what we call the heritage zone, right? So obviously you might have had different amount of exposure to the language. So you might have varying levels of, proficiency. So for example, some people have, they are passive bilinguals, for example. They never actually output the language, they fully understand it. So that's probably like very, down in there, in terms of the hierarchy here, perhaps. All right, so the prediction, so this sort of thinking about heritage grammars makes a prediction, right? So the prediction is that, in our cases, heritage Kurmanji and heritage Georgian, they should both be observed as intermediate stages in the monolingual acquisition of Kurmanji and Georgian, right? So all kids acquiring standard Kurmanji and standard Georgian, they should be going through a state, going through stages, one of which is, maybe not all kids, but at least some kids will exhibit this stage that we characterize as the heritage stage, right? So heritage grammars. So this prediction, I will make this more concrete when we actually discuss the data. All right, so this is the general idea behind the talk. All right, so let's start with Kurmanji and then we'll move on to Georgian. So Kurmanji has a tense-based split in its alignment. So it's a bit more complicated than Turkish and Shpibo, right? So it's a bit more complicated. So what we have is there is, different alignments across tenses. In the present tense, Kurmanji has accusative alignment, and in the past tense, it has ergative alignment, right? So the ergative and accusative cases, they happen to have the same form in Kurmanji. So they have a label for that in Kurdish linguistics. They call it oblique. So oblique as in not nominative, right? So I think they also call this direct, but we can just refer to it as nominative. All right, so the oblique case, that seems to appear only in transitive clauses, right? So it seems to correspond to the accusative here because it appears on the object, whereas in the past tense, it appears on the subject. So we want to call that, since it only appears on the subject of a transitive, we would call it the ergative case, right? So although the form is identical, one of them is accusative, the other is ergative. So they just happen to be syncretic. They have the same pronunciation. All right. Okay. So this standard, we are aware that obviously Kurmanji, like any other language, it has many geographical variants. So we are not interested in differences, across other kinds of differences across the variants. What we are interested in is the case grammar, right? So what does the variety do in terms of case? So this is called a split ergative system. It's an ergative system, but it's split, right? So it occurs only in one corner of the grammar, not everywhere. So this split ergative pattern is, so to speak, standard because it's observed, across many geographical variants of Kurmanji. So here's some data from Adıyaman, right? So Adıyaman dialect. So you see that the object here in the present tense, the object has the oblique case. So the nominative form of this, I think, is tu, not te. So you have the oblique form here, whereas the subject is, the same in both cases. They are marked alike. So we call that nominative. And in the past tense, we have ergative alignment because the oblique form that you find here now appears as the subject of a transitive, right? So the object of the transitive in this case is nominative. So you can see that it's identical to the subject of the intransitive here. It's simply is. And there's also something more weird. I mean, not weird. This is very common cross-linguistically. You can see, if you look at the sentence, the glosses, you can see that the agreement is actually with the object, right? So it's with the subject here, but it's with the object here, which again further corroborates the fact that, maybe you can only agree with nominative things. So this sentence says, you saw me, but the agreement is first person singular, not second person singular. All right, so this is ergative alignment, this is accusative alignment, and this is what we refer to as the split ergative system in Kurmanji. So how do we characterize this in terms of dependent case theory? So this is the final attainment state of standard Kurmanji. What we mean by final attainment state is like what does the grammar look like when the kid, learns the language and done with it, right? So it's acquisition kind of stuff. I mean, it never stops, but, it reaches the adults, it reaches a state, which is the target state, the speaking like adults, essentially. So, so what do we have here? So we have one ergative rule which is the upward dependent case rule, and one downward dependent case rule, which is the accusative rule. So when do we find ergative? We find it in transitive clauses and when the tense is past, right? So this is what we want to call ergative, and this is what we want to call accusative, right? So we will have one ergative rule, which will say, you know, if there are two MPs, if MP1C commands MP2, right? So two MPs, and if the tense is past, then MP1 is ergative, the higher one is ergative. So that's your rule, right? So this is one way to characterize that rule. Obviously, you can go more fancy and try to encode this in different ways, but this is, you know, descriptively, this seems correct. So the other rule that we will have is the downward dependent case rule, which is going to say simply the same thing, but with different tenses and directionality, right? So if MP1C commands MP2, assign the lower one accusative if the tense is present, right? So both of these conditions need to be met, right? So you need to have two MPs and also look at the tense to determine if you want to assign accusative or ergative. So this is the grammar of a standard Kurmanji speaker, standard with respect to the split ergative system. All right. Here is now we are ready to talk about the heritage, heritage Kurmanji. So here's our consultant's linguistic profile. We have one consultant who happens to be 34 years old, and they are Turkish Kurmanji bilingual. They grew up with the extended family, so I use they as gender neutral pronoun. They grew up with the extended family, grandparents. They were monolingual Kurmanji speakers, and parents were bilingual. They are bilingual Turkish Kurmanji bilinguals. And the parent-consultant communication is exclusively in Turkish, right? So the consultant essentially never speaks Kurmanji with them or with other people as well either. So importantly, the grandparents and parents of the consultant speak the Adıyaman variety, which is standard with respect to the case grammar, right? So it has the split ergative system where ergative appears on the subjects of transitives and accusative appears on the where ergative appears on the subjects of transitives under past tense and accusative appears on the objects of transitive under present tense, right? So these are the two scenarios where we find the oblique case, which we said is in one case ergative, the other case accusative. So they, the consultant for sure heard that dialect when they were acquiring the language. But what they are actually producing when they produce Kurmanji is different from the, the speech that adults around them have, right? So in the present tense, there is no difference. They use oblique, our consultant uses oblique for the objects of transitives in the present tense, just like in the standard variety, standard Kurmanji. But in the past tense, there's a change. There is something different going on. We find oblique, right? So the transitives, in transitive clauses, the subject is oblique, the object is oblique as well, right? So we have the oblique pattern. There are dialects of Kurmanji where this is, the standard, but our consultant were not exposed to such dialects. They were only exposed to the Adıyaman variety, but somehow their grammar converged with those dialects. So we'll see how that might have happened, right? So, but let's investigate what this could be a bit further, right? So what do we have here? So we wanted to call the oblique that appears on the subject ergative, and we wanted to call the oblique that appears on the object of a transitive accusative, right? So what does that make this? It makes it a ergative accusative string, right? So essentially these are found across languages. This is a tripartite system, right? So you have a different marker for the subject of a transitive, object of a transitive, and subject of an intransitive. You have three distinct, case values essentially. So this could be analyzed as that, right? So you have ergative here, accusative here. So both rules must have applied to produce this form. How do we characterize that? So how do we characterize that? It's actually, funnily enough, it's simpler than the grammar. I mean, not simpler in technical sense, but it has less text to write it. So So the final attainment state of this heritage variety can be characterized as follows, right? So you have the upward dependent case rule works the same as the standard variety, right? So you have, you are assigning ergative when MP1C commands MP2 and your tense is passed, right? So ergative appears then. But your downward dependent case rule, so your accusative rule, is underspecified with respect to tense, right? So you essentially don't have any tense information, your tense specification, which means that if it's underspecified with respect to tense, it's not going to look at what tense you are in to see, should I assign accusative or not, right? So it will just assign accusative if you have two MPs in the clause. So that's what we see. You will assign accusative no matter what tense you are in, right? So accusative, assigned. If you're an object, you get accusative. But to be able to assign ergative, you need to be past tense, right? So the subject needs to, there needs to be two MPs and the higher one will get the ergative if and only if the tense is past tense, right? So this part is the same as the standard variety, but this part is different. It's underspecified. It has, it doesn't have a tense specification. All right, as we said, the main claim that we are pushing in this work is, we are saying that the heritage variety is emerged as a consequence of incomplete attainment, which means that we should be able to observe the heritage variety being uttered by kids learning the language, right? So even if they, when they complete the attainments, when they actually acquire the standard variety spoken around them, they will not have that anymore. But when they are acquiring the language, the standard Kurmanji, they will exhibit an intermediate stage during the monolingual acquisition, where they are exhibiting a grammar, producing a grammar which is identical to the heritage Kurmanji that we are describing here, right? So in order to account for that, here's here's an acquisition path for standard Kurmanji, right? So this is a hypothesis. Obviously, we can't ascertain this. This is a hypothesis, and this is a possible acquisition path. We're not claiming that this is going to be the exact acquisition path for all speakers acquiring Kurmanji. It might so happen that this is actually quite random, and if you happen to go through these steps and if the acquisition stops at some point, you don't receive any more input or something, you will have incomplete attainment, and that might end up in a grammar which is identical to the heritage variety that we're describing. And as we will see now, it's actually the case, right? So what is in this path? So it says in the first step, you learn the downward dependent case rule. Right, so the downward dependent case rule, it says, if you have two MPs, mark the lower one accusative. That's all it's saying, right? So if MP1C commands MP2, MP2 is accusative. So this has no tense specification, nothing, right? So it only says, look at your clause. If you find two MPs, mark the lower one accusative. You're done. So that's your entire grammar, right? So for case grammar. This predicts obviously a language, a grammar, where all your objects are marked oblique or accusative, whatever form you have for accusative. So they will be marked alike. And your step 2, let's say, is the upward rule, which is learned along with the tense specification. So you have, this is our regular ergative rule that the adult grammar has. And finally, as a last step, you say that, oh, okay, my accusative is actually restricted to present tense. I shouldn't have that in my past tense because adults don't have it, right? So you kind of entertain some kind of hypothesis, you do some hypothesis testing and realize that your grammar is different from the adults, so you learn this additional step as well. So you specify your downward rule by saying it's only for a present tense, you're not gonna do it elsewhere. So here, if a learner goes through all of these steps, it reaches, the learner reaches the standard Kurmanji grammar that we have described, right? But if the acquisition stops after step 2, we end up with heritage Kurmanji, right? Because what happened here in the proposed acquisition path, the downward rule was learned as an unspecified rule first, right? So, for example, the child heard, all these present tense sentences, daddy eating, bread, whatever, like all these transitive sentences where you have oblique all over the place, and the child maybe entertain the hypothesis that, oh, all my objects are accusative, right? So, you go for the broadest rule or something, let's say. And then only after that step, you learn the ergative rule as a separate rule. And let's say your acquisition stopped there. And what you should end up with in this case is a grammar where all your objects are accusative and the subjects of transitives are ergative in the past tense, right? So because you haven't specified your downward dependent case rule with the present tense information, you didn't restrict your rule. So you should end up with the heritage kurmanji. So this, as we said, this predicts that, the monolingual acquisition of standard kurmanji will have heritage kurmanji as an intermediate stage, right? So this seems to be borne out. So there is a study that investigates the monolingual acquisition of kurmanji, and crucially, the kurmanji that is investigated, the adult grammar, is split ergative, right? So it is the standard variety that we described, and we observe that children between a certain age group dominantly, so not exclusively, but dominantly use the oblique pattern in the past, right? So this is the ergative accusative pattern that we have just said. So if this is on the right track, then we are learning that learners acquiring the standard kurmanji actually go through a stage of heritage kurmanji, right? So this is verifying the hypothesis that heritage kurmanji is actually it might have emerged as a result of incomplete attainment. All right, so here's some data that shows that children indeed produced oblique forms. So the adult language is split ergative. You find nominative on the object. So to nebedi, I didn't take you. Adult says, the child answers right? So no, you took me. So here you have oblique. On both the subject and the object, you have oblique, which is not what the adult is saying, right? The child is producing this, but the adult is producing the standard form. All right, so apparently this is the dominant pattern between a certain age group. Okay, so what do we learn from this? So heritage kurmanji turns out to be a natural stage in the acquisition of standard kurmanji, and heritage pattern corresponds to a learner at step 2, our hypothesis step 2. And crucially here, moving to step 3, right? So specifying your downward dependent case rule requires hypothesis testing. So what do I mean by that? So you have to realize that, right? So for example, the child saying such sentences, they have to, produce lots of kurmanji and hear lots of kurmanji so that they can realize, oh, what I'm saying is different from what my mom is saying, right? So they have to realize that. And for that to occur, there has to be lots of input, output produced by the child and received by the child. So if Turkish was dominant during the acquisition, so if you mostly heard and produced Turkish, then obviously this reduces the amount of input-output exchange, and this gives the child less chance to do hypothesis testing and revise their hypotheses about things. All right, so essentially now what we are doing, what I'm going to do next is to show that when we investigate the heritage pattern in Georgian, we might actually have the same sort of explanation. It's possible to explain it in the same. All right, so Georgian, so now I'm talking about the standard variety. Georgian has an aspect-based splitness alignment, just like Kurdish, but it's different. It's not tense, but it's aspect. You can ignore that fact, so it's essentially the same. You have imperfective aspect and perfective aspect. Imperfective has the accusative alignment, and under the perfective aspect, you have ergative alignment. So, but there is one further complication in Georgian. So Georgian is different from kurmanji in that it exhibits, in the perfective, it exhibits active ergative alignment. So this is a term that Wolford uses. So active ergative alignment is a bit different from the simple logic that we said, if you're a transitive sentence, your subject will get ergative. Otherwise, everything will be nominative. Right, so it's different from that because you have a distinction between intransitives, right? So between intransitives whose subjects are agent-like and intransitive whose subjects are patient-like, theme-like, right? So this is the classical unergative, unaccusative distinction. If you're not familiar with it, maybe these terms might help. All right, so essentially these are called external arguments and these are called internal arguments. And we see a split between the way MPs are marked according to this in Georgian, right? So you say, when you utter a transitive sentence, the subject gets ma in Georgian in the perfective, and the object has e nominative. And when you utter an intransitive sentence whose subject is a patient-like, you again have nominative on the subject. But if you utter a sentence with the with a agent-like subject, so the man cried, you have ma again, right? So we call it ergative here, following the literature. So it is, as you can see, intransitive subjects vary in the way their subjects are marked. So this is a complication. So here's a summary of what Georgian does in the standard variety. You have the accusative alignment here, clearly, because the object is different, right? So this is your object, these are subjects, these three E's are your subjects, and this is your object. So the object is marked differently, same with Turkish, same as Turkish, right? So this is no surprise. But this one is weird because you have ma here, two subjects, but this subject here is marked just like the object. So what's going on here? So how do we characterize this? So standard Georgian has three case forms. It has E, as we have seen. I color-coded them for those who are not colorblind. So E, S, and Ma, right? So E has the widest distribution. Let's call it nominative, right? So maybe it's the default way to pronounce an MP. Let's call it nominative. This S, the green one, appears only on objects of transitives in the imperfective aspect. And so it's called accusative. So we can call it accusative, right? So it's because it's an object marker. So it can be characterized as downward dependent case for sure, just like in the sentence. But how about ma? So ma appears only on external arguments in the perfective aspect, but crucially, it appears on all external arguments in the perfective aspect, right? So this also includes the subjects of some intransitive verbs, such as the unergative verbs, right? So this is a problem for the analysis of upward dependent case or ergative, right? So because upward dependent case needs two MPs in the clause so that you can say, oh, this one is dependent on the other, so we see ergative. But with unergative intransitives, you still have one MP, so how do you ever see ergative there, right? So that's a challenge for the upward dependent case theory of Georgian ergative. But linguists such as Leah Nash, in particular Leah Nash, claim that unergatives in standard Georgian are actually concealed transitives because they have this weird property that they require this reflexive prefix on the verb, right? So you have ergative, okay, but maybe this is here because this is actually transitive, right? So this is actually transitive. This weird E only appears on unergatives. It doesn't appear on accusatives. It doesn't appear on transitive verbs. So why should it be here? It's very suspicious, right? So if you say, well, maybe they are like concealed transitives, then you also make sense of the fact that you have ergative here, right? So Baker and Bobolick actually adopts Nash's analysis, claim proposal, and then say this is like an MP. So this is just like an MP. It has no difference from an MP. So it fills the theme, the patient position, the object position. So this is essentially a transitive clause, and the ergative is explained as dependent case again, right? So assuming that ma is indeed a dependent case, then the final attainment state of standard Georgian will be like this. It's essentially the same as standard Kurmanji, right? So except that we don't have tense specification, but aspect specification. So when your aspect is perfective, you have ergative, on the higher MP. If your aspect is imperfective, you have accusative in the lower MP, right? So you essentially have a system which is identical in terms of the theoretical assumptions that we're making now, identical to standard Kurmanji, except instead of tense, we have aspect. All right, so what does our heritage Georgian look like? So the linguistic profile of our consultant is as follows. So they are 61 years old. They are Turkish Georgian bilingual from İnegöl. They are fourth generation immigrant from Batumi. They live in a community which dominantly has Turkish, but there are people around who also speak some Georgian, so different varieties, because people immigrated from different regions of Georgia, right? So we also can't tell what sort of input they might have received. We also couldn't determine whether the consultant's parents spoke the standard variety, so we don't know, right? So this is a less clear case than the Kurmanji case, but we will work under the assumption that this is a heritage speaker as well. All right, so the key difference of heritage Georgian from standard Georgian is in the perfective aspect. So there's, essentially what we have as a system is Turkish, right? So if you look at this, you have ma appearing on all subjects, right? And E appears on the object of a transitive. So this is clearly an accusative alignment system, right? So the object is marked differently and all the subjects are marked, with ma, but in the perfective aspect. So here's a summary of the patterns that we find. So we have accusative alignment here. You have E, and the object is marked differently. And you have accusative alignment here as well. So ma, all subjects are marked ma, and you have a different marker for the object. So this is an interesting system, right? So you have accusative alignment in both cases. You don't have ergativity anymore, anywhere. So there is no ergative anywhere because we can't call anything here ergative. So it has accusative alignment in both cases. So what can we say here? We can say about the Heretic Georgian that there is no upward case rule because there is no ergative, nothing that we can call ergative. No hint of ergativity has remained. We have accusative alignment under both aspects. And weirdly though, Heretic Georgian still has preserved all three case forms, right? So we still have E, S, and Ma. All these forms are still there. So what has changed in effect is this, right? So this was E, but it's now Ma. I mean, when I say changed, I mean different from the standard variety. So this is E in the standard variety, Ma here, right? So just one tiny change, but it changes the entire system. The ergativity is gone. All right, so what is our hypothesis? Our hypothesis is that Heretic Georgian has just one rule, right? So because it has, just like Turkish, it has downward dependent case rule, and that's all it has, right? So it has no other alignment related rule, right? So it has accusative on both under both aspects. So it has this rule, which is underspecified for aspect or tense or anything. So if you have two MPs, mark the lower one accusative. That's all it says. But obviously we have three different case forms. So what do we say about that? Well, tentatively here, we will say that it has aspect dependent contextual allomorphs of accusative and nominative, right? So it has essentially two forms for accusative dependent on the aspect, just like you have, allomorphy in morphology, right? So, portmanteaus and, other kinds of contextual realization cases. This is maybe similar to that. It's not clear to us how to model this in the best way, but it's possible to say, at least. Entertain as a hypothesis, let's say. All right, so how did this Heretic variety emerge? We again want to hypothesize that Heretic Georgian might have emerged naturally during the acquisition of Standard Georgian due to incomplete attainment. All right, so we predict that again, Heretic Georgian should be attested as an intermediate stage in the acquisition path of Standard Georgian. And this is, again, it seems to be borne out, right? So there is not much acquisition literature on Georgian that we could access, but the study that we found claimed that, observed that aspect affects case forms from the beginning, right? So when children are acquiring Georgian, they are aware that there is an aspect split, right? So they say, oh, aspect is important, I have to be careful. Because we don't observe ever, we don't even see one overextension error. So what do I mean by overextension? So for example, remember ma appears in the perfective and su appears ma appears in the perfective and su appears in the imperfective. And we don't see that they are being used in different aspects, right? So the children are not making mistakes on that. They also observe that no error occurs for the downward case rule. Well, they don't say downward case rule, they say accusative is used correctly all the time. But they note that there are errors in the use of ergative, right? So the ma has, the children have trouble with ma. How do they acquire it? They go through some stages apparently. So what we find is children acquiring Standard Georgian seem to speak Heretic Georgian at some stage of their acquisition, right? So we actually, when we look at the data, we see that children are producing sentences like this with, ergative marked subjects who are, subjects, which are subjects of intransitive predicates such as shake, which is an accusative word, right? So here the adult form has nominative, it's because this is not concealed transitive or anything. So it has nominative here, but the child is producing the ma form, right? So ma doesn't seem to be ergative here for the child. It seems to be, at least we can entertain the hypothesis that it's being used as nominative in the perfect, just like we said. So this would be fine, for example, in the heritage variety that we are reporting, but it's not fine in the adult grammar of standard Georgian. Right, okay, so we are less clear about the acquisition path here, but if we entertain the hypothesis that, again, say that the downward rule is learned first, and additional rules about the upward rule and the specification of the aspect in the downward rule, they are learned later at later stages, then we can say that if the acquisition stops just after this, we end up with the heritage variety, right? So essentially what we find is accusative alignment under both aspects. And what we have, the differences in the case forms, aspect dependent case forms, they will be characterized as contextual realization, contextual allomorphs of those case values. All right, so but we need a very good morphological theory for explaining how this works. We don't have that yet. All right, so just to summarize heritage Georgian, so again, heritage Georgian could be characterized as a natural stage in the acquisition of standard Georgian. So if you're right in this acquisition path, right after the step one, after you learn the downward rule, if your acquisition stops or halts or whatever, then you end up with a variety which is identical to the variety that we call heritage Georgian. Right. So here, crucially, again, moving to the next step requires the learner to realize that their output, what they're producing, is distinct from what the adults are saying. Right. So adults are not saying such sentences. They are not saying such sentences in the adult form. We don't have that. But the child is saying that. So they have to realize that what they are saying is different from what the adults are saying. And that requires, again, a lot of input-output. Right. So you have the child has to produce has to receive correct input, the good data, and also produce output so that they can compare those forms and realize that they have to revise something. So if Turkish was dominant in the community that our consultant grew up, maybe it reduced the amount of input and output, and which gave them less chance to realize that their output is distinct from the adult input, right? So that could be responsible for the incomplete attainment again. All right, so here is my concluding remarks. So what I have said, the two heritage grammars that we have investigated, they appear to be naturally occurring intermediate stages in the acquisition of the standard dialects. So we seem to observe those. I mean, obviously we are, idealizing a bit. We have very little data on Georgian, etc. But this seems on the right track, at least based on what we have. This is again consistent with the idea that heritage grammars may obtain from incomplete attainment, right? So if the acquisition stops at some point, well, I shouldn't say stops, but halts or something. So we end up with incomplete attainment, and we also tried to show that dependent case theory allows us to model the final attainment stages of all these varieties, as well as the potential learning paths, right? So how the rules are added to each other, so to speak. So at every stage we have a perfect grammar, so there is no inferior grammar or anything like incomplete in any sense. So it's you have different rules and different grammars, so they just have a stage, a path of learning to those different rules. So what we can't yet say is, there we have some questions as well. So both of these consultants, right, so they are bilingual, right? So they also acquired Turkish as along with the other language. So Turkish has an accusative alignment, obviously. Could it have a more direct effect on the acquisition of the heritage languages, right? So maybe it did. We can't pinpoint that because it's hard to prove that in any sense. Maybe it created a bias, maybe some kind of bootstrap. And also, we said that the proposed learning paths in both cases, it started with the downward rule. So right, so you have this, essentially we said there is a bias, for the accusative rule, being learned first. So is this a universal bias? Is it coming from unmarkedness of accusativity? Because ergative systems, indeed, historically, they tend to decay into accusative systems. So we have that sort of change generally. So is it maybe about that? Or, and more importantly, is it specific to split ergative systems, right? So this is another question, right? So if you have a language like Spibo, and the children acquiring it, do they also go through some stage where they first entertain the hypothesis that there is a downward dependent case rule? Probably not. We hope not. But that needs to be looked into, right? So we don't have the answer for that yet. All right, thank you. This was the end. Thank you for listening.
Evet. Teşekkürler Ömer.
Rica ederim. Çok hızlı bir sunum yaptım sanıyorum.
Yok, gayet hem zamanı iyi kullandın hem de gerçekten her şey en azından benim için crystal clear. Şimdi bir soru cevap section'ımız var ama öncesinde bu 37. konuşma. 2012'den beri yapıyoruz yani bu konuşmaları. Benim en keyif aldığım konuşmalardan biri olabilir. Samimiyetimle söylüyorum. Çünkü ben şeyleri çok seviyorum. Böyle içinde mesela syntax var, morphology var, sociolinguistics var, işte language acquisition var. Her şeyden böyle tam bir interdisipliner, hatta intralinguistic çok müthiş bir konuşma oldu benim açımdan. Öncelikle çok teşekkür ediyorum onun için. Şimdi konuşmaya Türkçe başladık. Sen İngilizce devam ettin. Konuşmanın içerisinde de Kırmancı ve Gürcüce'den datalar vardı. O yüzden soru cevap section'ını İbranice yapacağız şimdi.
Evet, bence de mükemmel bir
evet. Şöyle. Şimdi bir soru cevap bölümümüz var. Ben dinleyicilerimizden hani soru sormak isteyen olursa panelden el kaldırmalarını rica ediyorum. Bu sırada onlar el kaldırma butonunu bulmaya çalışırken benim bir iki tane sorum var. Belki onları şey yapabilirim, sana sorabilirim. Birincisi aslında soru değil de daha böyle katkı olabilir diye düşündüm. Şimdi bu double oblique ile ilgili bunu accusative focus da deniyor tipoloji literatüründe. Mesela Tacikistan'da Ruşan diye bir dilde var bu. Ve bununla ilgili tipoloji literatüründeki temel şey şu, varsayım şu. Bir dil ergatiften yani ergatif sistemden nominatif sisteme geçerken genellikle bir ara şey olarak, form olarak şeyi kullanıyor aslında. Double oblique sistemleri kullanıyor. Aslında tam olarak sizin datanız da böyle öyle bir şey gösteriyor gibi geldi bana. Belki o literatürden hani tabii daha induktif bir bakış açısı aslında dil bilimsel tipoloji çalışmaları ama hani oradan da belki çalışmanıza bir destek şey yapabilirsiniz gibi düşündüm. Yani öyle bir katkı sağlamak istedim. Bir de şöyle bir sorun var aslında. Şimdi mesela ikinci şeyde Gürcüce dilde yani o incelemende şöyle bir şey var incelemenizde. Ergatiften nominatife geçiş var. Ya mesela neden nominatiften ergatife değil de ergatiften nominatife geçiş var? Bu genel bir sistem hakkında bir şey sezdiriyor mu yoksa orada daha dile özgü spesifik bir şey mi var acaba? Onu merak ettim.
Bir dakika tekrar şeyi söyler misin?
Şimdi ergatiften nominatife geçiş var dedin ya. Mesela ergatif tamamen kayboluyor dedin şey.
Evet, ergatif kuralı kayboluyor yani. Ergatif standartta ergatifi mark eden
yani o alignment kayboluyor değil mi?
Evet, alignment kayboluyor. Evet.
Şunu merak ediyorum. Neden tam tersi bir süreç yoktu ergatiften nominatife şey var? Yani daha doğrusu o alignment mesela ergatif neden kayboluyor da nominatif kalıyor? Ya da nominatif neden kaybolmuyor da ergatife geçmiyor? Onu...
Evet, tabii ki. Yani biz burada işte bir language change aslında anlatmadık. Yani bizim anlatmaya çalıştığımız şey neydi? Bu tabii language change ile ilgili süreçleri de informe edecek bir şeydir diye umuyorum ama bizim anlattığımız şey neydi? Aslında bu split ergative sistemlerin yani gramerin yarısı işte accusative yarısı ergative olan sistemlerde ne oluyor? Dili öğrenirken nedense en azından bu bahsettiğimiz speaker'lar accusative kuralıyla başlıyor gibi sanki. Öyle bir bias var gibi. Ve onunla başladığı için işte mesela kurmancı örneğinde hemen ardından ergative öğreniyor. Okey. Ondan sonra bir de accusative kuralını bu sadece işte present tense için diye specify etmesi gerekirken onu etmemiş bulunuyor. Çünkü onu edebilirse o zaman adult grammar'a, etrafındaki adultların konuştuğu şeye erişmiş olacak. Ama onu etmediği takdirde şey olarak kalıyor. Oblik olarak kalıyor yani şeyde. Hala accusative'de giriyoruz ergative'nin altında. Böyle bir sistem var. Yani hani duyduğu datanın split ergatif olmasıyla ilişkili bir şey diye düşünüyorum. Yani sen mesela Neden nominatiften ergative geçmiyor diye sordun değil mi?
Evet.
Nasıl olabilirdi mesela? Yani neden mesela atıyorum present tense'te ergatif söyleyebilirdi? Mesela evet, aynen işte. Bu benim sondaki sorumla aynı soru aslında. Eğer mesela rule'ların öğrenilme sırası tamamen randomsa, mesela some kids start with the ergative rule, some kids start with the accusative rule gibi bir durum varsa, o zaman farklı heritage variety'lerde, yani farklı incomplete attainment senaryolarda ergative nominative dönmüş present tense de bulabiliriz. Yani
Evet.
değil mi? Yani oblique nominatif formları
Evet. Evet.
present tense'te. Bunu ne kadar buluyoruz bilmiyorum. Ben literatürü çok iyi hatırlamıyorum. Ümit daha iyi bakmıştı onlara. Böyle şeyler de olabilir belki, emin değilim.
Merak ettiğim için sordum bu arada. Hani yani neden bu arada bu şey yani bilmiyorum genel dil sistemi açısından bir şey anlatıyor muydu? Belki de hani şöyle bir şey görebiliriz. Hakikaten e, işte Türkiye'de incelediğiniz ya da o mecrada incelediğiniz bütün dillerde sadece işte ergatiften nominatife geçiyordur şey hani işte o dil bilgisi sistemi. Bu
Hı hı.
acaba genel dil sistemi açısından bir şey ifade ediyor mu? Bir de onu bir şey yapmak, değerlendirmek lazım diye düşünüyorum.
Yani şöyle bir şey var, şunu söyleyebilirim. Mesela Gürcüce, standart Gürcüce işte imperfective'de nominative accusative, şeyde perfective'de ergative, yani aktif ergative. Ama mesela Lazca'da mesela şey yok, aspect split yok.
Hı
Hem
hı.
imperfective'de hem perfective'de ya da tense split de yok. Yani iki tense'te de, iki aspekte de ergatif nominatif görüyoruz. Yani orada mesela şey olmuş herhalde. Muhtemelen split ergatif sistem daha eski proto bir şeyi yansıtıyorsa diachronic change itibariyle Lazca şeyden, o protodan ayrılırken herhalde aspect split'i ya da tense split ne varsa artık onu yok etmiş, yani bir extension olmuş. Yani bu tarz bir şey hiç olmuyor diyemeyiz herhalde. Yani ergatif sistemlerde bir şekilde doğuyor.
Evet.
Ama en azından Lazca'da belki şey denebilir. Bu split ergatif sistemde işte split'in kalkmasıyla hani sistem fully ergatif oluyor, yani her yerde ergatif. Belki kurmancı için de böyle bir şey mümkün olabilir. Bilmiyorum ki, yani onu tahmin etmek güç herhalde.
Bir de bu
Ne kadar
bitmemiş bir
oluyor
çalışma
bilmiyorum.
galiba değil mi? Şey daha devam ediyor musunuz? Bu proje miydi? Nasıl bir şeydi bu?
Yok, bu proje değil. Biz bunu şeyde sunduk. Heritage Language Syntax diye bir workshop vardı
Hı
yakın
hı.
zamanda. Orada sunmuştuk. Yani bu Heritage Gürcüce datasını ben bayağı önceden almıştım. Ee, Ümit'in de kendi şeysi var, consultant. O da kurmancı için var. İkisini birleştirip aynı perspektiften açıklayabilir miyiz gibilerinden. İşte Metin sağ olsun bize epey yol gösterdi.
Evet. Bir
Yani,
ufak bir şey daha soracağım. Bu mesela işte Gürcüce için step 1'dan sonra edinim durur. İşte kurmancı için step 2'dan sonra edinim durur gibi hipotezler var ya. O hipotezleri test etmenin acaba bir şeyi var mı? Yolu var mı? Yine böyle çok magazin sorusu aslında bunlar ama herhalde böyle bir çocuğu alıp bir kafese kapatıp değil mi? Böyle onun
ya
etkisinde falan var.
bence işte multiple consult, yani bu heritage durumlarını daha fazla consultant üzerine inceleyip nasıl paternler görüyoruz? Farklı farklı şeyler çıkıyor mu? Bu bizi daha bilgilendirir. Biz şu anda tek speaker, her iki dil içinde tek speaker üzerinden baktık. İkisinde de accusative üzerinden. Hatta mesela Gürcüce için şeyi bile bilmiyoruz yani. Acaba consultant'ın duyduğu diyalekt o muydu direkt? Yoksa standart mı duydu? Bilmiyoruz ki bunu, çünkü ailesi henüz yani yaşlıymış zaten, vefat etmişler herhalde. O yüzden onu bilmiyoruz bile, ama kurmancı için biliyoruz mesela. Kurmancı için diyalekt Adıyaman ve standart, yani case açısından standart bir sistem. O açıdan Gürcüce için bilmiyoruz ama şey için, kurmancı için biliyoruz. Farklı işte o consultant'ın olduğu durumda farklı farklı aynı tipte insanlar bulup bakarsak varyasyon var mı yok mu? Farklı yerlerde freeze olmuş gramerler var mı farklı noktalarda? Bu şekilde anca şeyi anlayabiliriz. Yani o acquisition path gerçekten standart mı, unique mi, yoksa işte random mı tamamen? Neye göre oluyor yani? O sıra neye göre belirleniyor? Nerelerde durabilirsin? Tabii nerelerde durabilirsin definite bir answer'ı olmaz yani. Çünkü ne kadar engage olduğuyla, ne kadar input output exchange olduğuyla alakalı bir şey. Ama hani herhalde full tipolojiyi bekliyor olmamız lazım by default, yani her şey olabilir.
Evet, bu arada teşekkür ederim sorularıma yanıt verdiğin için. Böyle cahil sorular da sormuş olabilirim ama merakımdan çok hakim değilim çünkü literatüre.
Yani estağfurullah. Ben de bu işin uzmanı değilim yani. Bu işin uzmanı normalde metin. Biz hani teorik kısmından birazcık el attık gibi oldu. Biraz data getirdik falan. O yani.
Tamam, teşekkürler. Cem Hoca'nın bir sorusu var, hemen onu.
Hocam buyurun. Merhabalar.
Ömer merhabalar, Murat merhabalar. Herkese iyi akşamlar. Çok teşekkür ederim konuşma için.
Rica ederim.
İlgiyle dinledim. Benim heritage grammar kısmıyla da ilgili sorum var ama ondan önce şu dependent case theory'yi yakından anlamak için
Hı hı.
bir şey sorayım. Şimdi accusative ve ergative ve nominative ve absolute'den farklı olarak dependent demek benim aklıma 3 tane dilden soru getiriyor. Birisi Korece,
Hı hı.
birisi İzlandaca, birisi de Tagalog. Şimdi
Hı.
Korece'de evet nominatif var, marked bir nominatif var. Ama bütün argümanların aküzatif aldığı durumlar da var. Yani
Evet.
nominatifin olmadığı case'ler var. Ve bu mesela bir tanesi aküzatif, bir tanesi nominatif değil. Hepsi aküzatif olabiliyor. Aslında hepsi dative de olabiliyor. Enteresan bir durum ama yani böyle bir durum var.
Hı hı.
Bu durumda neye dependent olduğu, kimin kime dependent olduğu sorunu var.
Hı hı.
İzlandaca'da nominatif var ama nominatif ille subject olmak zorunda değil. Object de nominatif olabiliyor. Enteresan bir şekilde
Tekrar söyler misin İzlandacayı?
İzlandaca'da işte Körki subject'ten dolayı
Hı hı.
nominatif var
Evet.
ama nominatif subject olmak zorunda değil. Bir object de nominatif alabiliyor.
Hı hı.
Enteresan bir şekilde bir object o nominatif aldığında agreement de ona geçiyor. Yani agreement nominatifle gidiyor.
Hı hı.
Ama onun gittiği yer ille subject olmak zorunda değil. Object de olabiliyor.
Evet. Hı.
Bu özel fiiller için geçerli. Bütün sistem için geçerli değil ama bu var. Burada da o zaman yani bir dependency ne anlama geliyor o merak ettim.
Hı hı.
Tagalog'daki durum daha da enteresan. Orada da marked bir nominatif olduğu iddia edilen bir en azından Kroeger ona nominatif diyor ama tartışılır. Ang diye bir case mark var. Belli bir fiil çatısında mesela recent past'te
Hı hı.
bu ang yok. Bütün argümanlar aynı case alıyor. Ve bu case nominatif değil.
Evet.
Burada dependency bu üç durumda dependency sanki biraz e, zorlanıyor gibi geldi. Ben merak
Evet.
ettim ne şeyini.
Şimdi şöyle, benim anladığım şekil en azından yani practice edildiği haliyle her dil dependent ve nominatiften oluşmak zorunda değil. Yani dependent case'i bir logical possibility olarak sisteme introduce ediyoruz aslında. Mesela bütün case üzerine çalışanlar, her teori bir şekilde lexical case kavramını acknowledge etmek zorunda, bunu tanımak zorunda değil mi? Yani bir verb'in mesela yanındaki bir şeye case assign etmesi ya da işte preposition'ın case determine etmesi vesaire. Local bir şekilde. Bunu acknowledge ettiğimiz takdirde mesela otomatikman şey sorusu da geliyor. İşte tamam işte Chomsky haklı değil, yalan yanlış şeyler söylemiş, nominative T'den gelmiyor falan vesaire. Dedik diyelim. Ama eğer lexical case'i acknowledge ediyorsak, mesela atıyorum Preminger şey dedi, aslında Chomsky haklıydı. Nominative bir head case dedi. Yani aslında Preminger şey çalışıyor, dependent case çalışıyor. Yani bir sürü dil için dependent case analizleri veriyor. Ama İngilizce için nominative dediğimiz şeyin aslında T'den gelen bir head case, yani head'den assign edilen bir case olduğunu kabul etmemiz gerekiyor dedi. Yani dependent case çalışan insanlar da böyle head case gibi bir possibility'yi kabul edebiliyorlar. Her zaman her gördüğümüz accusative ve dependent dememiz lazım. Testlerini yapmamız lazım diyorlar falan vesaire. Mesela Preminger'in yine İngilizce'deki accusative için default case analizi var. Yani aslında accusative dediğimiz şey nominative İngilizce'de. Yani default. Yani her yerde çıkan case. Eğer özel bir case almıyorsan accusative'sin. Mantığı bu. Hani by default you're accusative. Çünkü mesela işte who came? Him diyoruz. Orada neden aküzatif çıkıyor mesela? Hani, değil mi? İngilizce'de öyle bir durum var. Ya da işte him, işte I like John falan gibi böyle topik olarak aldığımızda hani şey alabiliyor falan vesaire. O yüzden buna default case demiş mesela ama nominative yani he, she formları, they gibi formların sadece ve sadece finite t'nin altındaki durumda çıktığını söylemiş. Yani bu o zaman şöyle tekrar söylemek gerekirse mesela Korece'de atıyorum daha yakından bakmak lazım. Oradaki accusative gerçekten dependency ile alakalı bir şey mi yoksa default mu? Belki orada da nominative olan şey finite t'den geliyordur. Diğer her şey default case'tir. O yüzden characterize ederken hani traditional grammar'de buna accusative denmiş, traditional grammar'de buna nominative vermişten ziyade behavior'a bakmak gerekiyor. Yani dependency olarak karakterize edilebilecek bir şey mi? Yoksa işte default olarak mı karakterize edilmeye daha uygun? İşte head case olabilir mi? Falan gibi böyle şeyler, logical possibility daha geniş yani aslında. Chomsky'in sistemde çok dar bir logical space var. Dependent case, dependency fikrini ortaya attığımızda bir şey daha eklemiş oluyoruz aslında sisteme yani bir bakın.
Evet. Aslında bunun mesela ergative dillerde şöyle enteresan bir açılım var. Accusative dillerde olduğunu bilmiyorum ama ergative dillerin çoğunda, belki hepsinde bile olabilir. Mesela ergative morfoloji ile, ergative case morfoloji ile dative case morfoloji örtüşür. Yani ergative ile dative çok ortaktır.
Evet.
Şimdi accusative dillerde accusative'in adjunct üzerinde olduğu bir durum varsa bu da mesela enteresan bir benzerlik de olabilir aslında. Yani biraz önce diyordum ya her accusative olmayabilir diyordun ya. Böylece yakından bakmak lazım. Yakından bakıldığında o zaman bazı accusative'lerin belki de core argument'ları kodlamadığı ortaya çıkacak. Çünkü böyle durumlar da olabiliyor. Hepsi etik construction'larda mesela Korece'de olabiliyor.
Hayır.
Ama örgütif dillerde çok daha yaygın bir şekilde case morfoloji ile örgütif case morfoloji ile dative case çok örtüşüyor mesela.
I see, anladım. Yani şeyi bilmiyorum, sinkretizmle ilgili ne söylenebilir bilmiyorum. Bu bayağı nanosintaks literatüründe de özellikle sinkretizmi çok bakılıyor. Hani yakınlıkla alakalı bir şey falan deniyor işte. Sinkretik olabilmesi için o iki case'in yani incremental information building açısından syntax'ta yakın feature'lar olması lazım. Yan yana feature'lar olması lazım falan diyor. Belki o perspektifte işte atıyorum ergatif, accusative'e göre daha farklı bir şey olabilir yani. Direction'la alakalı değil. İçinde daha başka bir feature vardır. Dative'e yakınlaştırıyordur.
Evet.
Falan. Olabilir, bilmiyorum. Yani o sinkretizme dair çok bir fikrim yok açıkçası. Onunla ilgili pek bir şey söylenmedi bugüne kadar o literatürde. Onun dışında pek bir şey diyemeyeceğim sanırım. Ama çok güzel sorularınız. Teşekkür ediyorum. Ben bu Tagalog'u mesela bakmadım daha önce. Şeye aşinayım. Kore ve İzlanda oradaki paternlere aşinayım. Az çok. Korece'yi aslında Baker analiz etmeye çalışıyor. Bayağı bir phase theoretic bir account bir şeyler yapıyor
Evet.
böyle. Karışık bir şey. Hani neden hepsinin akuzatif aldığını falan böyle işte phase donuyor falan bir şeyler oluyor. Hepsi orada kalıyor. O yüzden çat çat çat hepsine akuzatif veriyor. Mesela öyle bir şeyler var yani.
Evet.
Bilmiyorum. Ama sanırım benim burada karakterize ettiğimden biraz daha sert bir tutumla yaklaşıyorlar. Yani dependent case çalışanlar genellikle her şeyi dependent case altından açıklama gibi bir hani şey var. Öyle bir şey var yani. Hani çaba en azından değil. Mesela atıyorum bence Gürcüce'deki ergative case yani şart değil onu dependent diye açıklamak. Çünkü çok bariz bir external internal argument split'i var yani. Gramerde öyle bir bilgi varsa case niye bunu aktaramazsın? Case niye bunu yansıtamasın? Yansıtır diye düşünüyorum. Yani illa onu böyle push edip aslında anergatifler transitifmiş. Oradaki iyi görüyor sistem işte. O yüzden ergatif falan demeye pek de lüzum yok gibi geliyor bana yani bilmiyorum.
Evet, bir o var. Bir de dependent case yani o zaman case iki noun iki NP arasında ilişkidir deyince hani o zaman verb ne yapıyor sorusu da çıkıyor ortaya. Yani case iki tane noun'un yaptığı şeyse verb efendi ne yapmaktadır sorusu çıkıyor ortaya.
Zaten orada bitmiyor iş işte yani iki tane noun arasındaki ilişki deyip çekilemiyoruz çünkü hep bir context define etmek zorunda kalıyoruz.
Evet.
Diyoruz ki işte if the t is past, if the işte t is finite mesela çünkü non-finite clause'da da default case nominative değil genitive deniyor. Yani işte nominalization'lara bakınca Türkçe'de mesela hani genitive dediğimiz yerde nominalization aslında nominative yerine çıkan bir şey. Subject case birden genitive'e dönüyor. Buna da mesela diyorlar ki işte DP içerisindeki default case genitive'dir, nominative değildir falan diyorlar. Yani Marantz'ın en azından böyle bir insight'ı var. Yani aslında konteksti de define etmek zorunda kalıyoruz. O yüzden implementation olarak yani en azından klasik Chomsky'nin gramerde implementation konusunda çok böyle net bir şeyim de yok yani.
Zaten genitive'i de DP'ye hapsetmek de doğru değil çünkü Rusça'da öyle değil.
Tabii değil yani.
Rusça'da genitive case alan verb'ler var. Yani,
Lehçede de olumsuzluk olduğunda sanırım
öyle mi?
object alıyor, genitive alıyor bildiğim kadarıyla. Genitive o yüzden evet DP'ye has bir şey olmuyor.
Evet, genitive'in ya sen nouns'un boş ver. Böyle bir ihmal edilme durum var. Ben nedense bunu hep alınmışımdır genitive adına. Ruslar aynı kesin böyle düşünmediklerini biliyorum. Az buz da değil kelime. Yani fiil listesi 15-20 tane diyebiliyorum. Biraz önce verbal morfolojiye girdiğin için heritage gramerle ilgili sorum da onunla ilgiliydi. Bu mesela heritage dediğin mesela Norveççe, Türkçe Norveççe örneğinde şöyle bir şey gözlemleniyor mu? Mesela dışarıda her işini Norveççe görüyor. Artık son derece fluent Norveç konuşan bir insan. Eve döndüğünde Türkçe'de mesela fiil morfolojisinde bir değişim gözleniyor mu?
Hiç bilmiyorum. Yani ben hakikaten
Mesela fiil çekimini basitleştiriyor mu? Yoksa infinitifle root formu fark ettirmemeye mi çalışıyor?
evet, yani farklı şeyler var. Mesela biz burada incomplete attainment fikriyle her şeyi halletmeye çalıştık ama aslında işte şey diyenler de var. Hani heritage gramerlerde kalan şey yani kalan proficiency'deki hani olan proficiency'de en çok iki dilin share ettiği şeyler kalıyor. Hani iki dil mesela aynı şekilde yapıyorsa onu tercih ediyorsun. Mesela diyelim Türkçe işte objectlerin hem accusative hem nominative yapıyor ama Norveççe zorunlu accusative yapıyor diyelim. Yani bu sadece basit bir örnek. Şey diyebilir mesela Türkçe konuşurken her şeyi accusative koyabilir. Çünkü ikisinde de share eden bir şey yani. O accusative'in olabilme possibility'si. Share eden şeyi koruyor falan gibi böyle şeyler de var. Hani dillerin arasında geçişler de oluyor. Sonuçta aynı zihin içinde store edildiği için bunlar doğal bir şey herhalde. Ama hani şeyleri bilmiyorum. Spesifik olarak neresi daha çok etkileniyor vesaire. Bunları bilmiyorum. Bu şeyde Mayıs'ta ilan edildi mi bilmiyorum. Bir contact workshop'ı yapıyor Deniz Tat. Ben de orada inşallah daha çok öğrenirim diye umut ediyorum. Tromsø'de olacak bu arada.
Güzel.
Evet. Bu literatür bayağı zengin yani. Ben de yeni dahil oldum aslında. O yüzden çok bir bilgim yok ayrıntılarda. Çok teşekkürler sorduğunuz için Cemal.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Evet, başka panelden el kaldıran yok sanırım. O yüzden kapatmadan evvel önümüzdeki haftanın konuşmasıyla ilgili de bilgi verelim. Bu arada tabii bu dönemin son konuşması olacak. Sonra tekrar Mart'ın 4'ünde başlayacağız. Bir aramız var. Biraz dinleneceğiz biz de. Mart'ın 4'ünden itibaren yine 12 adet konuşmacıyla karşınızda olacağız. Önümüzdeki hafta yine Orta Doğu Teknik Üniversitesi'nden Doktor Duygu Özge'nin bir konuşması olacak. Konuşmanın başlığını tam hatırlamıyorum ama İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi Instagram sayfasını takip ederseniz oradan bütün posterleri, konuşmaları, saatlerini vesaire, Zoom bilgilerini paylaşıyoruz. Aynı şekilde Twitter hesabımızdan da paylaşıyoruz. Ben kapatmadan önce sözü son kez bir Ömer Hoca'ya vermek istiyorum.
Evet, çok teşekkürler tekrar da davetiniz için ve de katılımcılara da soru soranlara da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Görüşmek üzere. Çok sağ olun.
Evet, teşekkürler Ömer. Ve dinleyicilere de teşekkür ediyoruz buradan. Önümüzdeki hafta yine saat 6'da görüşmek üzere diyorum. Herkese iyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar. Çok teşekkürler.
Ben teşekkür ederim.